Her books feature European-style potager. I had to look up how to say that. Designs with recipes for cooks who love to garden. Using her 6 steps to successful garden design, she will guide you to creating a kitchen garden that will become a sanctuary for you and your family. Ellen, welcome.
Thank you, Maureen. Can everybody hear me okay? I realize I forgot to put those silly little earbuds on, but if you can hear me okay, I will lean into the computer here and start to talk. It is such an honor. Well, thank you to everybody who's here today. I can't see all of you, but I look forward to chatting with you after. Today we're going to talk about the new Heirloom Garden, which is the name of my new book, and also something that I have been doing for a long time, and just really want to introduce the concept of seed saving to fellow gardeners. But first I want to just say thank you to Maureen for inviting me and to all of you for showing up. I want to tell you that I live in Vermont, and we have about 25 inches of snow out there covering the garden, and it's absolutely beautiful. But I grew up in Weston, Massachusetts. I was there from 1958 till 1980 when I was married and moved to Vermont. So, and I still summer on Cape Cod, so I have a fondness for Massachusetts, and I certainly understand your climate. But I was not a gardener. I wasn't really a gardener till I moved to Vermont, and I still wasn't a gardener. My husband was the gardener and I was the cook. But I did have a degree in art. I went to the Montserrat School of Visual Arts and had a design business, but he wanted to start growing vegetables. So we moved to his grandfather's small farm. It was only about 2 acres at first, and then we bought our own 10-acre parcel, and he started growing organic vegetables, and his goal was to sell them to the local chefs. We had been reading about the wonderful Chez Panisse in California and all the small farmers that were raising vegetables for local restaurants, and we thought we could do the same on the East Coast, but the East Coast people are a little bit behind the West Coast people by about maybe 5-10 years. So he still persevered, and I had an art business, so it was easy for me to set up a beautiful farm stand, and we sold vegetables. The problem we had was that our population, our year-round population, was about 1,500 people, and so trying to sell vegetables to a small population, most of which who would prefer to buy their vegetables at the grocery store, was a little difficult. This artwork that I'm going to show you for the first few slides is done by Mary Azarian, who is a Vermont woodcut artist, and I'll speak a little bit more about her in another slide or two. But I did love to cook, and my husband loved to garden, so it was a pretty good combination where he would grow the vegetables and I would create wonderful meals. And so it was very nice, except the fact that he couldn't sell his vegetables. So he had this great idea that he would write away to some of the European seed houses in Italy and England and France and see if he could get some seed varieties of some unusual salad greens and vegetables that the local chefs might be interested in. Because we were competing in price with the ordinary iceberg lettuce by the caseload. And so we started growing these unusual salad greens, and my job was to go out into the garden and taste everything and also try and sell things in our farm stand. And so as a cook, I would come up with recipes for things, but it still wasn't quite going as smoothly as we would have liked. So by and by, we started a little seed catalog called The Cook's Garden, since I was the cook and he was the gardener, and he really wanted to start importing seeds from Europe in bigger quantities. And so we needed to find some way to be able to afford those seeds, but also manage the fact that the minimum order was usually a 4-kilo bag, which is about 8 pounds. If you think about your typical lettuce seed packet, you get about 2 ounces. So there was a lot of seed that was coming into our house, and we needed to figure out what to do. So we started the Cook's Garden catalog, which some of you may remember. Mary Azarian did the artwork for us, which we were just delighted by her stunning illustrations were really captured what we were looking to share, which was to be growing something unusual and beautiful and flavorful and really step out of the ordinary. We ended up doing a lot of lettuce and salad greens because being Southern Vermont, our zone at the time was about 3. It sort of borderlined on 4, which meant that we could have a frost every month of the year. And so we really couldn't grow eggplants and tomatoes unless we had them under greenhouse, plastic greenhouses. And that wasn't very pretty, but of course we did that because we had a farm stand as well. But my job as the cook was to go out into the garden and taste everything and develop a vocabulary to be able to describe the flavors so that you as the seed catalog customer would want to try something. So something like this beautiful Cheeriola chicory, or this, Claytonia and this Cheeriola chicory and this troutback lettuce, we didn't have color photographs in our catalog. And instead, all I could do was write a description that says that this Claytonia is lemony and light, and that the Cheeriola chicory is bitter. But of course, I couldn't say it's bitter because nobody would want bitter. So I had to come up with words like crisp and tangy, and vocabulary that would make you want to try all of these various salad greens. And we did fairly well for a while, but one of the things that really stumped me in terms of trying to figure out a good flavorful word was the chicories. And chicories are absolutely beautiful when you are successful at growing them. They're a little tricky, but we had these Italian seed catalogs that just absolutely seduced us with the photographs of things like this heirloom radicchio lettuce and the Biondalis, chicory, but the flavor, that's kind of bitter, and it takes a long time to grow, and it was a real specialty crop that we couldn't quite get a handle on. So after doing this for about 10 years, trying to write recipes, trying to sell chicory, I finally turned to my husband and I said, you know what, I think it's time you let me go to cooking school in Italy. And he agreed, and I was very lucky to get a place with Marcella Hazan in Venice, Italy. It was the second to last year that she actually taught classes, and she was in her mid-70s, but the classes were absolutely wonderful. And every day on the way to the market, we would go through the Rialto market and I would pick up bags of wonderful vegetables like this chicory that is called the pontarella, and I had no idea how to cook it, and I would bring it to class, and sometimes she would show us how to do it, and sometimes she would just shake her head and say, why does anybody want to learn about chicory from America? No Americans like bitter foods. And it didn't occur to me that Americans didn't like bitter foods, but it was a reminder to me that it was kind of true. We really gravitate towards sweet foods. We love sweet tomatoes. We love sweet lettuce. We love sweet foods, and bitter was an acquired taste. I had a wonderful time in Italy, and I came back with a few good recipes. So my husband said, where would you like to go to cooking school next? Which was very generous of him. And I said, well, I had heard about this school called the Ballymaloe School in Shanagary, Ireland. And he said, sure, try it, and I just thought, well, I don't know much about it. People kind of made fun of me to go to cooking school in Ireland. But when I arrived at the Ballymaloe School in Shanagary, Ireland, this is when I wanted to become a gardener and a cook. And this is also when I started to learn about garden design and how important it is to have a beautiful garden instead of an ordinary garden. Now, we always thought our garden was pretty nice. It would raise plenty of vegetables, and we had a 10-acre farm at that point, and it was nice to be able to go out with a harvest basket before dinner. But when I walked into this space, I realized that a beautiful kitchen garden opens up all of your senses. Just walking through this wonderful hedgerow here, you can see it was just absolutely full of birds chirping, and then coming into this boxwood garden that surrounded these fantastic herb plants, the lovage. I can't even tell what some of these are, but this looks like some kind of a I don't even know what they are. They're so magnificent, but I remember the smell. I remember going to this little platform where I took this picture which was a little tree house that you could go into and look down on the garden so you could see the whole design. And of course, the taste and the flavor were just exquisite. And so I realized that this was really what I wanted our garden to look like. And I was there for about 10 days, and I called home and said, you know, I don't think I'm going to be coming home anytime soon. I want to stay here, which was a little bit of a threat because we had 2 young children and I did have to come home at some point. But I decided that I really wanted to design a kitchen garden that looked like this. And then I wanted to be a gardener. So it was a little bit of a hard sell. My husband was quite territorial about his garden. He had gotten used to the fact that he was the gardener and I was the cook. But I did convince him to take down a few of the plastic greenhouses and put up a really nice garden. But we had to start with keeping something beautiful in your mind, which is step 1 that we're going to start with today, design. How do you start designing that beautiful garden that you want in your mind? Well, this was the garden that I used as my model, and this is not the garden that we ended up planting, obviously. This was designed by Rosemary Veary in Kentucky, and I don't think you could find this much flat space in all of Vermont, but it is absolutely stunning. And by studying this garden, I realized that I could learn a lot just by looking at pictures and visiting other gardens. And so starting with this design, I looked first at this white bench, and I realized that that is the focal point. When you walk into this gate, you see that wonderful white bench, and it draws your eye into that space. And then, of course, notice the wonderful square edging of all of these orchard trees, and then the white tutors that are there for decoration, but that height gives it drama. And so it really turns an ordinary garden into something quite extraordinary. And even just looking at this square space here, instead of just being long straight rows or something that's broken up into a square, she's created a triangle that's edged in greenery. So I knew I had a lot to learn. Because this is a fairly typical vegetable garden. And again, it's not my garden. It belongs to a guy who lives up the road. But he's very proud of this garden, and he should be. And he has some nice elements here. Notice he has a fence that keeps the deer out. He has a few ripe tomatoes. He has the wildflowers in the background, and the Buddha under the tree just for a little meditation practice. But where I want to take you to today and are some of the things that I'm going to teach you about designing an heirloom garden is to try and visualize something beautiful in your mind and to create a garden that has height and drama and intrigue and texture and color and flavor and fragrance and all those things that we love about our flower gardens, that what we don't often attribute to a vegetable garden. So that's why I call this the new heirloom garden, because I want to share with you my 6 steps to success. Now, I didn't go to Hort School. I did go to art school. And I think this is where I became more of an observer. And so whenever I visited gardens, I would start to notice things about those gardens that I could then use in my own vegetable garden. Starting number 1 with the design and the beds, looking at the paths, the fences, the plants, and then adding personality. And these are the 6 steps that I'm going to cover today in the lecture. And after the lecture, I think Maureen will be sending you out a handout that gives you these in a printout that you can print out for your own copy. But starting with a plan, where do ideas come from? How do we get ideas? Well, being an art major and an art history major, I knew I could look back in history and start finding out the origins of kitchen gardens, which of course go all the way back to Adam and Eve. But the first documented kitchen gardens were known as the Paradise Gardens, which were in Islam. And they were based on a 4-square design, which was symbolic of the 4 cardinal directions, east, west, north, and south. And often they would plant them with seeds and plants that would come back to their gardens from travelers who had been to other countries. And then the 4-square was often divided by water and water element, which represented the 4 sacred liquids of life, which would be honey, wine, milk, and water. And so there was a lot of symbolism and poetry and charm about these gardens that really was an extension of their homes. Fast forward to the medieval times, when a lot of the beautiful kitchen gardens were hid behind the monasteries, and the nuns and the monks would maintain them, and they would grow medicinal plants as well as plants to feed the hungry and to feed their chickens and their horses. And it was a huge sanctuary for meditation, prayer, health, and everything that one needed to sustain life. And when you look at the old monastery gardens, again, you see a lot of that geometry that plays into the gardens, because geometry is also carried through into the Renaissance period at the Chateau de Villandry and the Chateau de Versailles, because orderliness is next to godliness, and keeping a beautiful garden was something that brought you closer to God himself. And so I, again, noticed these squares, these 4 squares. I'm trying to find my cursor here. These are red and green cabbages that are then intersected by crosses of flowers. And again, looking at the variations at all of these beautiful square gardens at the Chateau de Villandry, show again how that 4 square design goes back in history for centuries. This is a garden at the Colonial Williamsburg, and again, if you see those gardens, I think this was taken in early spring before anything had started to emerge, but that 4 square design again represents an orderliness that's so different than the way we often think about gardens today. And it's a very European potager kind of approach to gardening, with the tree as this focal point, and then around the edges they're growing their herbs and their flowers. So that 4 square design is something that, when I started writing my first book, The Complete Kitchen Garden, this cover right here, I started to look at that 4 square design and scale it back for the homeowner. How do you take that 4 square and fit it into a small space? And I realized that there are lots of variations on 4 squares, and these are some of the designs from that book. You can see this is what I call the paint box garden. So these are raised beds that are not just set up side by side, but are set up as a whirligig. This is the I can't remember which garden this is, but again, these are benches that surround a tree, so that there's an area for a little quiet area for meditation and prayer. And this is the garden that is based on my own garden, shown here, which I mostly grow lettuce and salad greens. But that 4 square design, when you're planning your design on paper, really works well for an organic rotation, crop rotation, which is something that's used by farmers. It's something that's been used for centuries. Again, growing different crops in each one of the plots. So if you're growing the legumes, the beans and the peas, they're setting nitrogen into that soil, so that when the leafy greens move into it in the following year, they will be able to absorb the nitrogen out of the soil, and the legumes then move to where the root crops have been growing, the carrots and the onions and the potatoes, and they will replenish that soil and build that soil with more nitrogen again. And then the root crops go into where the flowers and the fruits and flowers have grown. And again, it's called a 4 square rotation, which is a really nice way to be able to plan the garden on paper, so that you know where all of your crops are going to go each year, and then move them to build that soil organically. So in 2003, I moved off the farm to a smaller plot in Manchester Village. And at first I didn't think I was going to garden, but of course, once a gardener, always a gardener. And I, by that time, had become quite attached to growing food. And so I set up my first 4 square design in my own backyard. And one of the things I did is I put my focal point in. This is a viburnum. And I put a bench in the garden, and I'm going to talk about benches, but if you take only one thing home with you today, I want you to try and find some place to put a bench in your vegetable garden. I can't tell you how many times I've been to vegetable gardens and seen they're just magnificently beautiful spaces, but there's no place to sit down and enjoy them. And even if you don't take the time to sit, it's nice to just, you know, throw your jacket on there, or think that you might be able to go out and sit, and you might as well have the opportunity if you have a bench there. So think about putting a bench. I meant to tell you in the beginning I hope you're taking notes and drawing as you go. I'd love to see some of your design ideas that you're coming up with, because again, this is a class about design. I will talk about plants, but I want you to be visualizing how some of these elements can be interpreted in your own garden. And so we're going to go to step number 2, which is the garden beds. Sorry, my little box is in the way, so I couldn't tell. Out of clutter, find simplicity. Again, the 4 square is just one idea. There's lots of ways to be growing food. You can be growing food just in little baskets. I love this hanging basket from Chanticleer Garden in Pennsylvania, where the way they're growing flowers and lettuce. And it's a great way for people who live in small spaces or condominiums. But most people these days are growing their vegetable gardens in raised beds. And I have a little bit of a problem with raised beds. And I guess just because I'm sort of an, you know, a traditionalist, I often find that when I see raised beds in people's yards, they're stacked up side by side like these beds are. And these happen to look nicer than a lot of raised beds. And I think it's because the gardener used these wonderful old-fashioned not tongue and groove, what are they called? Knob, you know, like post and beam kind of beds that are actually made on Cape Cod at the farmstead. If you want to write that down, they're made in Chatham, Mass. But also because they have a lot of style. She's added some height and some variation in these, but oftentimes raised beds can be side by side. And then you get a little dusting of snow, and they look a little bit like a cemetery plot with little mounds just right next to each other. They don't have a lot of visual interest to them. So I often suggest that gardeners put some pots next to them and soften the edges a little bit to extend beyond the raised beds. Another shot of the gardens at the Chanticleer Gardens in Pennsylvania, and they actually raise their own willows so they can make these beautiful wattle fences around their raised beds, which I just think are so attractive. And I've seen these wattle fences also at Strawberry Bank in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and I've thought about raising my own willow so I can try doing that myself. Because they add such a nice style. But these are the small elements that really make such a difference in your garden. And I'm going to talk about style quite a bit, because we all start with the same 3 things: seeds, plants, and soil. And each one of our gardens reflects our own personality and our own style. This is a garden in Vermont, and it's a reminder that one of the beautiful things about growing food is that you're starting mostly with annuals every year, so that the garden is always a blank canvas of ideas, and it can change each year. And this is a picture of my garden early on when it was maybe about 5 years old, and it's early in the spring, and it has never looked this neat and tidy since, but it was being photographed for magazine. But again, I can change it up. Once all this lettuce is gone, then I'll put a whole nother design of plants in that garden and keep playing with the textures and the colors and the variety. And it's much easier to do if you're working with this standard bed, which I call standard agricultural beds, instead of a raised bed, which kind of limits the amount you can do in a raised bed. Step number 3, paths. Paths are the bones of the garden. They're what keep the structure solid, but usually by midsummer you don't really see those paths. But paths are very, very important when you're setting up the design on paper. I love showing this example of a garden in Shelburne, Vermont, because it's absolutely wild and wonderful. And I love that backdrop of the dark black barn in the background with the pink popping out. But without the paths, it would just look a little wild and crazy and not very organized. another example of the paths at the Colonial Williamsburg Garden. And I love the way they have functional paths that go through the garden, breaking up that space into 4 squares, but then have those lovely clamshell paths that create triangular aspects to this garden. I was speaking there it wasn't last spring, it was 2 springs ago, and I showed this picture and saw this garden again, and I realized that there's one thing they really need in this spot right here, which if I were in person with you, I would ask you, but I will tell you that white bench that we saw in that first picture, wouldn't that be nice to have a big white bench right there that draws your eye into that space? Well, the head gardener has since told me that he did put a bench in there, so I felt very pleased that my suggestion of a bench was received. These are the gardens in Cornell, and they have wonderful botanic gardens at in Ithaca, New York. And I love these wide open paths and the way the stone has been used in the paths as well as the beds. And notice even these beds have little benches built right into them. So it's a wonderful way to incorporate and keep everything looking very consistent. Just the opposite is a more narrow path that leads into the house, and I love the way this is surrounded by food. Can't you just picture getting out of your car with a harvest basket and on your way into the house, you're harvesting your lettuce and your peas and your chicories and your herbs and everything you need, and then you can just start dinner right away. Paths are something that are really nice for keeping the weeds out and keeping everything organized. I love this garden in Charlotte, Vermont, and the way the stones show that it's got a little bit of a wiggly-piggledy to it, but it's still working and functional and keeps the soil from spilling into the paths. And notice how neat and tidy that brick is, because the weeds haven't been allowed to grow in them. But at this garden, at the Hollister House Gardens in Northwest Connecticut, I love the way they have allowed some of the volunteer plants to escape out of the garden beds, and those wild plants will eventually bloom. And it's just such a wonderful sight to see when you see it in the spring, and then you go back in the fall and you see all these wild foxgloves and the wonderful amaranth and shishu and herbs that have been allowed to grow in that garden. So it takes the formality out of that brick path and gives it a really nice informality. Paths are also good for dog training. This is my little girl, Bella, and she's an Australian cattle dog, and I was training her not to go into the garden beds. And you can see by July, she was pretty well trained not to go in the garden beds. But this is also to show you that my paths are about 4 feet wide. Notice the bench in the garden. And because by August, when the garden starts looking like this, there's no room for the plants to grow. And if I didn't have 4 feet wide paths, there would be no room for me to be able to walk into that space. So it's very important to have nice wide paths so you can walk 2 by 2 with your partner or showing a friend around the garden. One of the things I learned about paths, sort of the sad way and the hard way, but eventually the good way, was that after Hurricane Irene came through Vermont and ripped out a lot of our beautiful old covered bridges and really wreaked havoc for a lot of farms and low-lying areas, I found that the water that came off Mount Equinox right behind my house washed through my garden and created a rivulet that for the next 2 years just kept washing my garden downhill. So I had 2 choices. I could either change my garden or I could change my path. And so I created a new path with river stone. So when it rains, it actually goes through the garden. What you can't see is I also did put a very slight edging around the garden to raise it just a little bit. And luckily now I don't have that much water coming through the garden. But what I learned is that by changing the path, it also changed the color of the garden. Instead of that brown path, I now have this kind of blue-gray path, which really picks up all the wonderful colors of the kale and the chard and the rhubarb, and it's like changing the color in your living room. It didn't take much. It just really changed my feeling about my garden, and I actually like it a whole lot more now. So step number 4 are fences and gates. Every child is an artist. The problem is staying an artist when you grow up. And I know we all know that quote by Pablo Picasso, but I really like it in this context because I feel that we're all artists. You know, I went to art school and now I'm a gardener and I'm a cook, and I'm sure many of you are painters and illustrators, but every time you go out in the garden, you're thinking about color and you're thinking about texture and you're thinking about combinations of things that you like, and how does this pink go with this blue, and what about this yellow, is it going to contrast with that orange? We're always thinking like an artist. And when I was in art school, one of my teachers would never allow us to turn in a painting and say it was finished unless it had a frame around it. And I thought that was the most absurd thing, because you know, I didn't want to spend the money on a frame being an art student. But when I started to gardening, I realized that a frame around a picture is like putting in, I'm not trying to get this here, it's like putting a frame around your garden. This is a lovely garden in Dorset, Vermont, and this white fence is like a picture frame around her garden. It's so stunning. There's a lot of white here because Dorset is also the home of marble quarry. So she's put in a marble pathway, and she's used marble in her paths in the garden. And notice she has a focal point here and white chairs over here. So there's a lot of white going on here. You know, it's a fairly low fence. It's 4 feet high. And if you had problems with deer, one of the nice things about this fence is that you could actually put a pole up on each one of these fence posts and then run fishing wire or some kind of wire around there, so you really wouldn't see the wire as much as you would the fence. But this fence obviously isn't keeping deer out, but she didn't seem to have a problem with it. But she has some other nice elements here. Notice she has a picnic bench for eating outside in the garden, which I think is so lovely. And this wonderful little garden shed here, which keeps her garden tools. And she also keeps a refrigerator out there for keeping chilled wine when she's entertaining in the garden. So she's really thinking about the garden as an extension of her home. Another example of a wonderful fence is this garden, this kitchen garden in Charlotte, Vermont. And this is early spring. You can see the garlic has started to come up, and the strawberry trellis in the center will be planted, and the pole beans will soon be growing on these trellises here. But one of the things about having a very simple fence is that it really creates that framework. If you were to squint your eyes a little bit not to see the fence, it would just look like an ordinary, beautiful, abundant garden. But having that fence, again, probably not high enough to keep the deer out, but she can create some type of buffer. That wonderful simple fence is a wonderful way to make a transition from the garden, the lawn, into that garden space. A garden on Cape Cod. I love the way she's painted it, this historic Benjamin Moore color that really picks up the sage and the lavender and the blue salvia of the plants, and it really accents all of the colors. And creating a garden gate is a wonderful way to create that transition into the garden from the lawn into that space. And when you go into that space, it becomes more of a sanctuary. You close the gate behind you and it makes a nice little click. And then you go and sit down on the bench and inhale and just open up all of your senses to this beautiful, lovely kitchen garden. This is an example of my garden when it was about 10 years old at that point. I've now been here 17 years. And these wonderful Nicotiana somehow found themselves at the entrance to the garden that kind of create a lovely little sentry. One is growing better than the other, but I love the way they've kind of you know, provided a lovely entrance into that space that creates kind of a hidden garden behind. Again, beautiful Chanticleer garden, using a simple fence and trellises and that arch that we saw in one of the earlier pictures, and a little sign that says welcome. And then I don't know what the other sign says. I'd have to get my glasses on. But since this garden is open to the public, it's a nice way to be able to just remind people not to eat anything in the garden or something like that. But again, that fence creates the boundary and the sanctuary space. A wonderful garden, a trellis garden. Some of us have hillsides, and this I thought was a really good example of showing how to trellis the garden and also make it inviting. This is one of the favorite gardens from my first book, The Complete Kitchen Garden, which shows that you can grow flowers and food together. You can grow poppies and calendula along with beans and basil and raspberries. And one of the things I love about this garden is that she also has a little tree house here in the apple tree, so that when her kids were little, they would play in that tree house. And now her grandkids play in that tree house, because she'll say, let's go out and play in the garden instead of work in the garden. Notice how our words really make a difference in how we convey what we love. And so her kids would go out and play in the garden while she continued to have fun and with her food and her flowers. This is a garden in New Hampshire, and I helped design the interior of it. The stone walls were built by Dan Snow, and he built that little hobbit house in the background that serves as a tool shed. And I just love the way they hired somebody, I don't know who, to make that gate with the circles that mimic those big round boulders. And it just creates such a wonderful just whole piece to the whole unit. I feel like if it didn't have that gate, it wouldn't have the same charm. So when you're thinking about gates, try and create something that really mimics the whole and brings everything together. Step number 5, heirloom seeds and plants. And I haven't really mentioned that word heirloom very much, but I will in this section. And I love this quote: listen to your broccoli, and your broccoli will tell you how to eat it. And I put that here because, you know, many of you probably already grow food. Maybe some of you used to grow food, but it seemed like it was a lot of work. And I'm sure all of you grow flowers. But I really feel that growing food connects us to our food in a deeper way. And that if you're growing broccoli, you are probably going to do like I do, which is before I harvest it. I mean, I wash it all summer long, and I don't go on vacation that week it's going to be ready. And then before I bring it into the kitchen, I talk to it a little bit, and then I bring in the kitchen, probably take some pictures for Instagram. I'm really paying attention to that broccoli. Whereas if I just bought a broccoli head at the grocery store for $1.49, I would probably overcook it. And you know, it's a green vegetable, but really when you're growing your own food, you develop this deeper appreciation for what you're growing. But heirloom seeds are really seeds that are open pollinated, which means that for many, many decades, gardeners couldn't have a garden unless they saved their own seeds. They were open pollinated, so if they were growing a tomato or a sweet pea seed, they would be able to save that seed and put it in the ground and grow that same tomato and that same heirloom flower. But by and by, we had seed catalogs. Burpees was not the first, but we like to think of Burpees as one of the originals. And seed catalogs kind of influenced what we grow. Not only did they start catering to big scale farmers, because those are their biggest customers, and then most of us went along for the ride, because if they were selling big boy tomatoes, that's what we would grow as well. But along the way, flavor really lost out. And by around the 1950s, seeds were being bred to be hybrid. So they were more disease resistant, they were bigger, grew faster, you know, had all these attributes that we as gardeners started to think is something that we really wanted. And we forgot that within every plant that we grew in our garden, seeds were naturally developed, and we weren't saving them anymore. We were just eating them because we could always buy more in the seed catalogs. And so we've sort of lost interest in becoming seed savers. And I'd love for you to be able to start exploring what it means to be a seed saver. This is the seed growing on a red deer tongue lettuce, which is an old heirloom variety. And look how beautiful that is. Usually if a lettuce is going to seed in our garden, we'll harvest it before it gets to this point. But if you just allow that plant to grow, just one plant, just one, allow it to grow into a seed head, and then see how it develops this these fine fibers that will then turn into seeds, and then save a few. It's really an exciting moment, I feel, to be able to grow a garden from seed to seed, to be able to push a seed in the ground from a seed that you grew the year before. But better than that, you can also save seeds and share them with other people. Something like chocolate runner beans, which are a magnificent, they're like a regular scarlet runner beans, but look at the color of those beans. Aren't they extraordinary, those seeds? Once you start looking at seeds and exploring seeds and seeing the colors and the textures, and you'll start to develop this curiosity. How did they get those speckles on those seeds? And why are some of these bean seeds pink and some of them purple? And it just adds a whole new dimension to becoming a gardener, is to be able to grow food, but also grow seeds. Two more examples: the cranberry bean. This is an old New England variety, and I'm humored by this because when I was studying with Marcella and Hazan, we would get a bean in the market called a borlato bean, which is a lemon, a very famous Venetian bean, and it's actually very similar to the cranberry bean. And I imagine that those bean seeds came over with immigrants and were started to grow here in the US, and then they became known as the cranberry bean, but they're more or less the same bean. And same with this Jimmy Nardello pepper, which looks like a hot pepper, but it's a wonderful sweet frying pepper. And it's an open pollinated and an heirloom variety. And it was brought over by immigrants in the Nardello family, and they saved it and continued to share the seed with friends. And it's now become a fairly mainstream heirloom variety you can get from a number of catalogs. Also growing in my garden, I love growing herbs, culinary herbs of all kinds. And if you don't have a big garden, it's the best thing to grow in a big tub outside your kitchen door. All of my books have recipes. This is a recipe that's appeared in probably 3 of my books. It's a herb cheese bread recipe, and I just love using herbs, especially basil. I think every one of us grows the sweet basil, but did you know that there are actually 80 different kinds of basil that you can grow in your garden, and most of them you can grow from seed. There's the opal basil, which is an old heirloom variety. The true sweet Genovese is an Italian heirloom variety. There's the piccolo verde, which is a tiny little leaf basil which has the most pungent flavor and is absolutely the best for pesto. Or there's the mammoth leaf basil, which grows a leaf the size of your hand, and you put a piece of fish in it and put it on the grill. It infuses it with a basil flavor. So basil is always in my kitchen garden. Mescalone really means miscellaneous greens. It's a French word. It goes back to when immigrants would harvest wild chicories and wild arugula and wild greens that would supplement their diets. And now it's become known as something we buy in the grocery store as mixed greens, and it makes a quick instant salad. But you've probably noticed it doesn't have much flavor when you buy it in the grocery store. So it's really much better if you can grow it in your own garden and mix up a variety of different cutting mixed lettuces and arugulas and chicories and mustards. I love the mustard family. This is the Osaka purple mustard, and it grows quickly in the spring. And notice you can grow it in your flower garden. And by the time the Osaka purple mustard is ready to harvest, then your tulips will be able to start growing. So it's a great way to interplant if you're a flower gardener and a food gardener. Of course, ruby chard or rainbow chard is a workhorse of the garden. It's one of my absolute favorite plants. I grow it starting April, and I'm harvesting the last of the leaves in end of November. And endives and chicories, I really encourage you to try growing chicory and endive. It's a wonderful green in the summer when you can't grow lettuce and it's too hot, and it just adds a nice perky green flavor to the salad bowl. Speaking of salad bowls, this is one of my favorite lettuces, which is a red iceberg lettuce. And I always like to sort of stop and pause here and just admire the beauty of a head of lettuce. There's so many heirloom lettuces that we've totally forgotten about because we've become so accustomed to just growing the butter crunch or the black-seeded Simpson. But expand your universe a little bit and look for some old heirloom lettuces. And I often like to share that whenever I look at this, I often think maybe brides should start carrying heads of lettuce instead of roses down the aisle. And of course, heirloom edible flowers. The borage is a favorite of mine. It was the first flower that I started growing, and the nasturtiums and the lemon gem marigolds are so wonderful. There's a lot of old-fashioned flowers that are fragrant. We've sort of lost that fragrance in many of our flowers. And so look back in seed catalogs. There's a wonderful flower seed catalog called Select Seeds, and they offer this nasturtium which is a vine called a canary creeper nasturtium, and it's a very late to bloom flower, but it's a unusual foliage, and you can see the bees really enjoy it. And fragrant sweet peas. There used to be 80, 90 different kinds of sweet peas available for gardeners, and now we're pretty much limited to maybe 12 or 15. It was a standard fare for most gardeners to grow sweet peas. And so remembering those wonderful old-fashioned heirloom flowers, and of course artichokes. I have an 80-20 rule where I grow 80% tried and true things I always liked, make sure that I have. And then I always try 20% new and different. And one year it was artichokes, and I was successful, which really surprised me. And I had about 5 or 6 wonderful artichoke buds to eat on my birthday in July. The Frais de Bois alpine strawberry, those wonderful tiny little strawberries that you're not going to find in any supermarket or even farmer's market. You can only find them in your own garden. And of course, heirloom tomatoes. I couldn't choose which picture to put up, so I put both of them up. There's so many wonderful colors, and we all know that heirloom tomatoes absolutely have the best flavor. They're a little trickier to grow. They can do some cat facing and some funny disease things, but boy, once you're successful, there's just nothing like them. And heirloom potatoes, you know, in the grocery store, we're so limited to the what are they? Norland Red, Yukon Gold, russets. We're starting to find a little bit of the all blues, but think of all the different kinds you can grow. The French fingerlings, the Russian bananas, the red thumbs, the red bliss, the huckleberry. There's hundreds of different kinds of heirloom potatoes, and think what fun it would be to just grow an heirloom potato garden. And I love to put carrots in this talk because I really feel that carrots have been largely ignored ever since the 1950s when breeding really took hold. Heirloom carrots were kind of just something you'd only find in your own vegetable garden because the carrots were bred for strong tops so that the combines could dig them out of the field easily, because most heirloom varieties such as the Scarlet Nantes or the Touchon have very weak tops, and so you have to have either really loose soil or go out and dig them up with a garden fork. But once you start tasting carrots, real carrot flavor, you're not going to need all those dips that they sell in the grocery store to give those carrots flavor. They're going to have really wonderful carrot flavor, which I know doesn't really tell you what a carrot tastes like, and as a food writer I should be able to describe it, but they're earthy and they're sweet, and I put them into this wonderful tarragon carrot tart in one of my books. So the final step number 6 is personality. I have 2 quotes here. The only art I will ever study is stuff I can steal from, which is really a reminder that we're all borrowing ideas constantly. Every time we cook, every time we garden, every time we draw, we're borrowing ideas that we have accumulated from our memories. And in our gardens, I like this quote, there's a fine line between art and junk, which is my segue into my friend Jan, who couldn't throw anything out. She loved to stop at antique stores and find things that she could put in her garden. And honestly, I think the garden really served more as a place for her to have her stuff. But it made her smile. It made her enjoy her space. And honestly, that's what gardening is all about. We all want to be able to smile when we go in the garden. And so find things that are whimsical, that remind you of somebody you loved. I have garden statues that were from my great-grandmother that I put right in the center of my garden. And often I go by and I just pat the head of my little garden statue, and I just remember my grandmother, because gardens are full of memories. They're full of art. This is an example of an old watering can I saw in a friend's garden, and I don't know how old it is, but I'm really hoping someday somebody starts a little museum of watering cans, because there's so many great examples of them. We've largely just hung them up in our garden shed and prefer to use our plastic hoses, but when you see an ornament like that, bring it out and put it in your garden. I'm remembering to create playhouses for your kids or just for yourself to go out and have a cup of tea, and to add a little bit of whimsy and charm. And one of the things I do in my garden is I like to do treasure hunts sometimes. One time I got all these little plastic frogs and I hid them around the garden, and I had some friends bringing their kids over, and they went out and explored trying to find all the frogs in the garden, and they came back with a real frog, and they were so excited. And that was really creating a memory for them. So not only are they eating tomatoes along the way and smelling the flowers and looking for things in places that nobody would look, but they're creating memories of that garden. Arbors are a wonderful way to grow vines. I've become rather obsessed with growing vines, lots of different morning glories and climbing roses, and just being able to create those archways, again, like the gates going into the garden, which makes a fantastic transition into that space. And remembering to put a bench in the garden. Again, a bench is so important to be able to sit and inhale and smell and really pat yourself on the back and say, wow, that is such a beautiful space that I've created. Instead of jumping up and going to pull that weed, just relax a little bit. Pour a glass of wine or drink your coffee out in the garden. Garden sheds are also really integral to design, and sometimes we forget that garden sheds can be more than just a place to store tools. They can be a place where you can go out and sit in the garden or draw in the garden or start your plants. And I wanted to just say that I am doing a couple of design classes coming up this spring. One is going to be at Tower Hill, and another is at the Coastal Maine Botanic Garden. And I'll also be teaching a class of my own, which will be a 4-week class as well. So some of these ideas I will continue to share in my classes. But our gardens are not just about ourselves. They're really about nature and everything that goes into the garden. And I know we're always fighting out those pests. We're constantly battling the squirrels or the deer or whatever else is getting into the garden. But when we create an attitude around the garden where it's open to whatever needs the garden for survival, such as the bees and the pollinators and the birds, we're really creating an open space to say welcome into the garden, because gardens are about extensions. We often think of my space as my garden, but really our properties connect to everybody else's property. So it's all about supporting nature and really enjoying that space. So I'm going to just share a little bit about my new book. My new book is officially in bookstores starting Tuesday, February 2nd. I'm not sure why they chose that date, but that's what publishers do. This is the front cover and the back cover of the book. An heirloom garden is an opportunity to plant a piece of history that provides a deeper connection to the food you eat, the people you love, and the landscape that surrounds your home. And I hope I've conveyed some of that in this lecture to you today, just sharing a few design ideas from the book. This is the Arc of Taste Garden. In the book, it actually has an ID that tells you where to plant things. I want to make it easy for gardeners to get some ideas for how to plant an heirloom garden and what to plant in an heirloom garden. But ultimately, I want you as the gardener to make the decisions of what you love to grow. plant what you love to eat, plant different things that you've never tried before. Just imagine a garden that is really more than just a place to grow food. This is a design from the book. You can see how it's laid up with the plant keys. And I have 10 reasons to grow an heirloom garden. And I'm not going to go through all of those, but the most important ones I want to leave you with is that I feel that the best tasting vegetables are heirlooms. The most fragrant flowers are heirlooms. And the most interesting plants are heirlooms. Heirloom produce, I can't read because I don't have my glasses on. I should know this by heart. Heirlooms create healthy nectar and pollen for pollinators, and heirlooms have a natural tolerance for regional conditions. And most of all, heirloom seeds can be saved year after year. As a gardener and a cook, I'm proud to say I can do both now. I've managed to figure out how to garden. I have recipes in all of my books, and I had wonderful photographer Matthew Benson take the full color images that are just extraordinary. He's really done such a beautiful job, and this is one of my favorites, the ground cherry clafouti. If any of you have grown golden tomatillo, you know that there's sweet little fruit that really, this is the most delicious little easy dessert or luncheon to make. And so I want to encourage you to grow beautiful food. There's really nothing like being able to go out into the harvest, into the garden with your harvest basket and bare feet, and just to be able to harvest some delicious foods and to share what you love with others. It's so important as gardeners, and to really think about how you can introduce other gardeners to growing food. You might not be able to grow a magnificent cabbage like this, but to show people how to push a seed in the ground, watch it grow, and then have that wonderful pleasure of being able to say, I grew this. So play with your food in the garden and in the kitchen, and to remember there's really only two things in life that money can't buy: true love and homegrown heirloom tomatoes. So thank you very much. I appreciate the audience, and I look forward to taking questions. As Maureen was saying, if you would put your questions into the box, but also let's chat, let's see each other. That would be great. So you can order your book through my website, or you know, Amazon, of course, or local indie bookstore, and follow me on Instagram. So
Ellen, thank you so